I've just made a huge discovery about Gnar and how exactly his jump works. For example, you can manipulate the way Gnar jumps and send him all the way to the backline and insta-kill the enemy carry. But there's also other tech like bypassing the front line and jumping straight to the backline. So with Gnar and this video, you can learn on how to exploit the enemy's positioning and give yourself a huge advantage. But I'll also show you situations where Gnar's jumps can be awful due to bad positioning that you should avoid at all costs. But how exactly do you get Gnar to assassinate the backline? What are Gnar's counters? And will Gnar reroll completely stomp the meta? Before we get into that, if you want to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe. Okay, so first we need to understand how Gnar normally jumps before we start making him jump to the backline. But before that, I will stress that headliner Gnar is absolutely necessary. Gnar needs the ability to instantly transform and jump, or else none of this tech will work, because by the time Gnar jumps, all the enemy units will have moved away from the enemy backline. Headliner Gnar technically has unlimited range before he transforms, so it doesn't matter where you put him, the only thing that matters is the closest unit to him, because he would then aggro and jump onto that unit. For example, in this clip, Gnar jumps to Yone because Yone is the closest unit to Gnar. This technique is very powerful because you can bypass annoying stoneplate users like a Mumu and get straight to the backline. That by itself is amazing, but there's a whole lot more you can do. But now let's break down how Gnar jumps. Here we have Gnar diagonally across from Olaf, and Gnar jumps behind him but to the left. Now what's important to understand here is that Gnar is jumping from hex to hex, as in he'll jump from one hex and land in another hex. Even though it may seem simple, it is important to know that Gnar will always land in a hex. And we can see that in this clip, it doesn't matter how close or far Gnar is to his target, as he'll still make the same jump behind Nico. But moving on, here's a clip of Gnar jumping to an enemy straight in front of him, and we can see that he jumps right behind him. And if there's an enemy to Gnar's right, he'll jump behind him to the right. So one way of visualizing how Gnar will jump is to draw a line from where he is and to his target. And usually Gnar will land in a hex that follows that path behind his target. And we can apply this visualization to the other examples. But things get very interesting when this jumping line is very steep, and we can see that in this clip. What's happening here is that Gnar is jumping more hexes horizontally than he is vertically. So Gnar is still trying to get behind Set, but this time behind him is to the left of Set. Okay, so let's start making things a bit interesting, and let's think about what happens if the hex that Gnar wants to jump to is blocked. Obviously Gnar can't land there, so where does he go? So as we can see here, Gnar lands in the hex beside his target or just in front of where he wants to land. But you should know that Gnar tries to land as close as possible to his original landing destination. And even though he could have landed to the left of his target, he didn't. And you can see here that if we mirror Gnar's jump, it still holds true. You can also see this when Gnar does his horizontal jump. Even though Gnar wants to land where Yone is, he can't, so he'll jump to your side of the board. And I think this is in place as a sort of protection to Gnar to make sure he doesn't jump into bad spots and aggro the entire enemy board. But this achieves the exact opposite and usually will put Gnar in a very bad spot. So in my opinion, you should avoid this type of jump at all costs, especially when Gnar is in front of your front line. But of course you'll ask, okay, what happens if that hex is also blocked? Where does Gnar jump then? Right, so this time he jumps one hex behind his target, but to the right. And of course, if we mirror this, it still holds true, where if Gnar jumps to the right, then he'll land to the left. So what I believe is going on here is that the game is checking each hex around Gnar's original landing location to see if Gnar can still go there and still be in range of his original target. Because remember that Mega Gnar is a 1 hex range unit. But pay close attention to the fact that Gnar still aggros onto Nico here. That's a really important detail when of course you ask what happens if that hex is also blocked. And the answer to that is in this clip, which was also in the intro. And we can see that Gnar instantly jumps onto the Ziggs. But what's important to note here is that Gnar's aggro onto his original target is now broken, because Gnar is more than 1 hex away from that target and is not in range of them. And so since Gnar is 1 hex range and facing forwards, he then aggros onto the Ziggs and claps him before he has any time to scale. But hold your horses, things get even spicier when you start thinking about getting your groove on. So not only can Gnar not land in a hex that contains a disco ball, but also we can see what happens if that 4th hex is blocked. Gnar just jumps to the left of it. This is actually mental. With Gnar, you can heavily punish your opponent's bad or disco positioning by sending your bruiser boy Giga Gnar to the backline, which means that under the right conditions, Gnar is one of the only true assassins in set 10, as you can pull off some disgusting boards when you combine other sources of backline access like KDA Akali and Karthus. But I'll talk more about this in my next video, which is a Gnar reroll guide. But this tech isn't perfect. There is a slight problem where Gnar takes aggro from nearby melee units as if Gnar was already in that hex before he jumped. You can see that in this clip where Kayn and Qiyana aggro straight onto Gnar. And there's also an anomaly I can't really explain in this clip. Following my rules, Gnar should have jumped to the left of Echo here, but instead he jumped to the right? The best explanation I could think of is that if Gnar jumped normally here, then he would have aggroed 3 different units. But if you jump to the right, then he only aggroes 2. So maybe the AI favours the alternative jump because Gnar is safer. This same example happens again literally the next round. But what's even more interesting here is that Illaoi aggroes onto Gnar here. Which makes me wonder if K'Sante or other frontline units could aggro onto Gnar if they're within 1 hex of his jumping destination. And that would mean that on the left you would have Mordekaiser, Qiyana and Illaoi potentially aggroing onto Gnar, but on the right you only have Illaoi and K'Sante, so Gnar jumps to the right. That explanation makes more sense to me than the other one I thought of, where Gnar can't jump to hexes that obstruct the pathing of other units. And that one doesn't quite make sense to me because surely other units could just walk around? Like, yeah, I don't know. But let's summarize how Gnar jumps exactly. And this image should do that. Usually Gnar will want to jump behind his target, but if that hex is blocked, then Gnar will move to hex 1. But if the hex 1 is also blocked, then Gnar will move to hex 2, and if hex 2 is blocked, he'll move to 3, and so on, right? But note that this is for Gnar jumping right and diagonally. If he was jumping horizontally, then you would need to rotate this diagram, and if Gnar is jumping from the left, then you would need to flip this diagram. I've left question marks on that 5th hex because I don't know what happens if the 4th hex is blocked. I assume Gnar will jump there to the 5th one, but I'm not sure. So let me know if you find out anything about this. I've not been able to test it myself because who on earth puts their carries in the 3rd hex? Why do you always put your man's in the 3rd hex, by the way? I always see this, like you're playing like as if you can't use a backline. Why? It's not set 3, bro.
No, I'm back in set 3 still. I'm just training for it. Sort of mental image.
So let's talk about Gnar's counters and the flip side of trying to exploit an enemy Gnar's carry and how he jumps. As I mentioned earlier, Gnar has some really bad jumps that you want to avoid if you're playing him, but ones you want to exploit if you're playing against him. And that case specifically is when Gnar jumps in front of the front line, which will then cause Gnar to take aggro as units die. And I think the best way to do that is by positioning like this with these Illaoi tentacles, but you could use units instead of the tentacles. This is the best way to counter Gnar because it baits Gnar to jump into the front line and hence take aggro from the enemy carries. This positioning means that Gnar should be placed in the center between the tentacles so Gnar jumps to the side of the tentacles. So to give the enemy less room to play Gnar, you should move the tentacles 1 hex in. But another huge counter is Qiyana, who can lock Gnar down, timer stun him and distribute loads of items. And since Qiyana is 1 hex range, you can easily put her behind your front line and close to where Gnar will jump, so she will instantly aggro onto him. And while it may be a bit wasteful, Edge and Knight on your backline will keep them safe from the Gnar burst. But if you're playing against Gnar, make sure you don't clump. And if you have a melee scaling carry like Yone, keep them away from Gnar as Gnar will just 2-tap them. But if you have items like Branduin's Omen or you're playing Disco, make sure you leave gaps to bait Gnar in, as otherwise Gnar can heavily punish your positioning. Mega Gnar has only 1 hex range and you should be looking to exploit that as much as possible. But yeah, there's a lot to Gnar positioning, but that should cover most of it. I am working on the Gnar reroll guide now and that should be coming out soon. As a teaser, you may have noticed how in most of these clips I usually build Runaan's on Gnar, and that's because Gnar is such a good user of Runaan's because of how much AD he has and how close he can be to the backline. But of course I'll talk more about that in that reroll video. Besides that, I hope you all had a Merry Christmas. But now let me pass over some questions to you guys. How useful was this video? Will you try Gnar out? And do you think he'll become meta? And that's it. Remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me, and as always, Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.